The cartographic array had been wrong for the third consecutive morning, and Elliot Voss had developed the specific kind of patience that only comes from working with systems that are technically functioning and practically useless. The console along the far wall of his apartment, a modest, slightly apologetic space on the mid-tier residential deck of Callaway Station, displayed the Kepler sprawl's outer sectors in soft blue relief, every uninhabited rock and frozen corridor mapped and catalogued and arranged with the quiet indifference of a universe that does not care whether anyone shows up to document it. He had a correction flag open on grid 7. He had been staring at it for 11 minutes. He had also, at some point during those 11 minutes, finished his coffee without registering the experience, which meant the morning had already peaked and it wasn't yet 8. Algorithm sat on the secondary console with the posture of a philosopher who has considered the evidence and found the whole situation beneath comment. He was a large gray cat with one permanently skeptical ear, and he had opinions about the cartographic array that he communicated primarily through strategic placement of his body on the components most critical to its operation. Elliot moved him. Algorithm returned. This had been their arrangement for 4 years, and neither of them expected it to change. Callaway Station was, by most assessments, a transit hub rather than a destination, the kind of place people pass through on their way to somewhere with a better atmosphere and a legitimate claim to having been chosen. The residential decks filled and emptied on a rhythm that followed the shipping lanes, and the faces in the corridor changed often enough that Elliot had stopped learning them. He did not dislike this. He had come to Callaway Station 7 years ago for a surveying consortium contract that paid adequately and asked very little of him beyond professional competence and the ability to tolerate recycled air. And he had stayed because leaving requires a reason, and he had not yet produced one that satisfied him. His apartment had 3 plants, the third of which he had named Suspicious, because it was the only one still technically alive, and he felt it owed him an explanation. There was a wall map above the secondary console, pinned beneath a strip of warm light, showing a rocky moon orbiting a gas giant whose name he'd never been able to pronounce correctly. Valen Crossing. He looked at it the way people look at things that cost them something briefly and at an angle. He submitted the correction flag on grid 7, stood up to make a second coffee, and was halfway through the argument with the machine about the grind setting when someone knocked on his door. Not pinged, not submitted a visitor request through the building management system, which would have sent him 3 notifications and a summary. Knocked, with a hand, on the physical door, like a person from somewhere with actual weather. He stood holding an empty mug and looked at the door for a moment because this needed processing. Algorithm looked at the door too, then at Elliot, in the manner of a consultant reviewing a client's poor decision-making history. He opened it. The woman in the corridor was tall, and the first thing the station's corridor light found was the faint luminescence running along her jaw and collarbones. A pale amber tracing, geometric and alive, like something between a circuit diagram and a tide. Silver-gray skin. Eyes that were a deep, compound amber, with that second transparent eyelid that caught the light and held it a fraction of a second longer than it should, the way certain materials hold warmth. Her hair was dark and dense, almost architectural. She stood in the way that people stand when standing still is something they were taught rather than something that came naturally, weight distributed, exit angles noted, the hallway measured and understood and filed before she said a single word. She said his name. He knew her. He did not know her. Both things were loudly and simultaneously true, and they did not resolve, and he stood in the doorway of his apartment on an otherwise structurally unremarkable Tuesday, and felt the particular disorientation of a man whose internal map has just been revised without his consent. 20 years, he said the only thing available to him. You found me. She said, I told you I would. From behind him, Algorithm made a sound of moderate philosophical concern. Elliot's manners, which had been installed early and were apparently resistant to shock, stepped forward ahead of the rest of him. He moved back from the door. She came in, and the apartment, which had always seemed the appropriate size for one person, one cat, one set of professional obligations, and one collection of mildly unresolved feelings, immediately seemed to be engaging in quiet structural apology. She looked at the cartographic display. She looked at suspicious. She looked at algorithm, who looked back with the focused assessment of a senior official evaluating new staff. Elliot closed the door. He said, "Can I make you coffee? I have to warn you, the machine and I are in a dispute." She turned from the display. That faint luminescence shifted, amber deepening, almost imperceptibly at her jaw. She looked at him the way she had in the doorway, with a precision that made him feel briefly like a coordinate. She said, "You still make jokes when you're nervous." He said, "I make jokes constantly. Nervousness is just when they get load-bearing." Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but definitely in its direction, the way certain stars are not yet visible but are already affecting the gravity of the space around them. She sat down at his table, and he went to fight with the coffee machine. And the morning, which had given absolutely no indication of being anything other than a Tuesday, continued to be revised. The coffee machine produced something that was, by any reasonable metric, a personal affront. Elliot set the two cups on the table with the careful neutrality of a man presenting evidence he knows is incriminating, and sat down across from her. Sierra looked at her cup. She looked at him. She picked it up and drank, and her expression did not change, which he found both impressive and mildly alarming because his expression had changed and he had made it. "It's the grind setting," he said. "We have a disagreement. You mentioned. I want course at once fine. We've been at an impasse since March." She set the cup down with the deliberateness of someone who has consumed worse things than bad coffee, and has made peace with that fact. The bioluminescent lines at her jaw held their amber steadiness in the apartment's morning light, and he found himself noticing, the way you notice something you've been carefully not looking at, the geometric scars beneath them, running parallel to the lines, or sometimes intersecting them, in the specific way that nothing natural ever quite manages. He did not ask yet. He understood, the way you understand the weight of a sealed container before you open it, that there was an order to this. "How long has it been?" she said, not as a test, as a beginning. 20 years, he said. "And about 14 hours if we're counting from the transfer notification, which I was, for a while." She looked at the wall map above the secondary console. He watched her look at it and felt the familiar pressure in his chest that came with anyone paying attention to it, except this time the pressure had a different quality, less like grief and more like a seam being opened carefully, with the right instrument by someone who knew where it was. "You kept it," she said. "I kept it. You couldn't pronounce the name of the gas giant. I still can't. I've made my peace with it. The consortium lets me label things." She turned back from the map, and something in her posture shifted, almost nothing, a degree of adjustment, the kind of change that a person without military training probably wouldn't register. He registered it. He wasn't sure yet what it meant, but he filed it in the growing category of things about her that were the same and different in the same breath, like a translation of a text he had once known in another language, accurate in meaning but altered in every word. She told him how she had found him. He had expected something. He had not expected this. She walked him through it with the matter-of-fact cadence of someone delivering a systems report, the decommissioned colony records that still existed in the secondary archive of a habitat platform that had been repurposed 3 times and renamed twice, the refugee processing database on a station that now operated under a different designation and a different jurisdictional flag, but had not, apparently, cleared its intake logs from the corridor conflict years. The volunteer genealogical project, 12 years in duration, that had been quietly reassembling the personal records of evacuated and destroyed mixed-species settlements, including Vale End Crossing, from whatever fragments had scattered across the sprawls, various data repositories like seeds from a plant, no one had meant to grow. 12 years, he said. Someone spent 12 years on that. Several someones. That's either very noble or very alarming. In my experience, she said, those categories overlap more than people expect. The algorithm, who had migrated from the secondary console to the middle of the floor with the quiet authority of a party who expects to be consulted, sat between them and watched the conversation the way he watched the cartographic array, with focused attention and a complete absence of any intention to help. Sierra looked at him. Algorithm looked back. She extended one hand, fingers a joint too long, and held it low and still in the patient way of someone who has learned not to approach anything without first demonstrating they are not a threat. Algorithm leaned forward and touched his nose to her fingertips. He then sat back and looked at Elliot with an expression that communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, that he had already formed an independent assessment, and Elliot was welcome to catch up at his own pace. He doesn't do that, Elliot said. Do what? The nose thing. He's done it twice in 4 years. Once with me and once with a maintenance technician who turned out to have been right about the ventilation conduit. She looked at Algorithm with something that wasn't quite sentiment, but was making a sincere effort in that direction. He has good instincts. He has excellent instincts and a deeply inconvenient personality. We balance each other out. She was quiet for a moment, and the station's ambient hum filled the space the way it always did. The low, continuous presence of systems performing their functions in the walls and floors and ceiling. The sound of a place that is always technically awake. He had lived inside that sound for 7 years. He had stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat, which is to say you only notice it again when something makes you afraid it might stop. I knew the transfer records would be the hardest, she said. Colony transfers from that period were logged inconsistently. Different species, different administrative systems. Your family's records had been partially migrated into a format that was already obsolete before the migration finished. That sounds like every system the consortium uses. It was worse, but there was a school attendance log. From Valen Crossing, still in the original file structure. She paused. Your name was on it. He thought about this. He thought about the fact that a school attendance log from a colony he had left at 9 years old, on a moon he could no longer name correctly, had apparently survived the evacuation and the conflict and 20 years of bureaucratic entropy and 2 decades of someone deciding not to delete it, and had carried his name across all of that to land in her hands. He said, I was absent a lot, actually, whenever we went to the ridgeline. She said, I know. I was the one who told the attendance system you had a respiratory calibration appointment. He stared at her. You covered for me. Several times. I had no idea. You were busy falling into the creek. He laughed, sudden, genuine, the kind that arrives before you decide to allow it, and the sound of it did something to the room, loosened something in the ambient air between them. And when he looked at her again, the luminescence at her jaw had shifted, just slightly, to a warmer register. She was not smiling, but she was, unmistakably, somewhere in the room where smiles happen. He picked up his terrible coffee and held it in both hands and thought that the morning had now moved well beyond the reach of any map he currently owned. The station's light cycle moved through its slow rotation toward the artificial afternoon, and neither of them suggested stopping. This was how Elliot understood that something significant was happening, not from anything said, but from the way the hours passed without either of them reaching for an exit. He had lived alone long enough to notice when his apartment had decided to become a different kind of space, and it had made that decision quietly, somewhere between the second terrible coffee and the moment Algorithm had relocated to the couch, and arranged himself with the specific composure of a host who has accepted the party is running long and has chosen to be gracious about it. Elliot had eaten something at some point. He was fairly certain Sierra had not, and when he asked she said she had eaten on the transit shuttle, which he acknowledged and then ignored and produced food anyway. because it gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through the larger project of understanding what kind of conversation this was becoming. She ate without comment, which he chose to interpret as acceptance rather than tolerance, and the afternoon arranged itself around the table the way afternoons do when no one is watching them carefully. She had started to tell him things, and the telling had its own architecture, careful, load-bearing, each piece placed before the next was introduced. He had learned not to push the pace. He had learned this partly from instinct and partly from the way her bioluminescent lines shifted when a subject arrived at its edge, the amber cooling slightly, not to cold, but to the particular temperature of a system running a process it would prefer to run privately. She told him about the 6 months. Between his family's transfer and the attack on Valen Crossing, 6 months had passed. She had spent them, she said, doing what they had always done, going to the ridgeline, cataloging rocks, attending school with a partially fraudulent attendance record. She said this last part without looking at him, and he understood it was not humor exactly, but it was the seam where humor lived, and he honored it by not treating it as anything else. Then she told him about the attack. Not in detail. In the stripped, structural way of someone who has told a version of this story enough times that the emotional sediment has been compressed into something hard and navigable. The colony had been targeted as a secondary asset in a resource conflict that the major powers had subsequently agreed, in several binding diplomatic documents, had never technically constituted a war. This was, she noted, the kind of agreement that is very useful for the people doing the agreeing. Diplomatic language, Eliot said, is just cartography for things people want to leave off the map. She looked at him with the expression he was beginning to understand meant she was deciding whether he had said something worth keeping. That's accurate, she said. I may use that. I'll send you an invoice. Add it to my account. He didn't know what to do with the lightness of that, with the fact that it existed at all here in the middle of this, except to hold it carefully and be grateful for it. The station hummed. Algorithm made a small, self-contained sound on the couch that communicated nothing specific and everything general. She told him about the conscription program. Her species matured in compressed biological cycles, what amounted to 4 years of childhood by their own calendar, which mapped imprecisely but significantly onto 8 by human reckoning, which meant that by the time the contractors had assessed the surviving children of Valen Crossing, she had already been, by their metric, approaching the upper edge of the developmental window they considered optimal for conditioning. She said this with the precision of someone recounting a technical specification. He listened with the precision of someone understanding, for the first time, that the technical specification was her. The program was not crude, she explained. That was the thing people misunderstood when they imagined such things. It was not violence deployed against children. It was patience deployed against children, which is a different instrument entirely and significantly harder to defend against, because patience arrives in the shape of care. They had understood her species' neurological architecture. They had understood the specific junctions at which identity is constructed, and the specific conditions under which those junctions could be redirected. They had been, she said, very good at what they did. How long, he asked. 15 years. He was quiet. The number sat between them on the table like an object with significant mass. That's most of my adult life, he said, not to diminish it but because he needed to locate it in real time, to give it the dimensions it deserved rather than the abstracted weight of a number spoken aloud. Yes, she said. It's most of mine. He thought about the 15 years he had spent doing largely unremarkable things. The consortium contracts, the sector maps, the coffee arguments, the dead plants. He had lived those years in the ordinary way of someone who is not at war, which had always felt like a neutral fact and now felt, suddenly and uncomfortably, like a form of fortune he had done nothing to earn. I thought about Valen Crossing, he said. After we left, my parents said it was a development transfer, good opportunity, better infrastructure on Callaway. I was 9. I believed them for a while. Then I got old enough to check the records. What did you find? Incomplete records, typical for that period. I found the evacuation designation. I found the conflict classification. He paused. I found the part where it said there were survivors, and the part where it stopped saying anything about where those survivors went. She was looking at him directly, and the amber of her eyes had that quality he had noticed in the doorway, the double-layered steadiness of someone receiving information and processing it without letting the processing become visible. You looked for me, she said. It was not a question. I looked for records. I told myself I was looking for records. There's a difference. There's a very thin difference, he said, and I was standing exactly on it for about 3 years. Something shifted in her expression, not the almost smile this time, but something quieter, something that sat further down. The luminescence at her jaw moved through a color he hadn't seen it use yet, a brief and cooler tone, like light passing through something deep, before it returned to amber. Algorithm had relocated again. He was now on the table, which was a violation of an agreement so old and so consistently ignored that Elliot had reclassified it as a historical document rather than an active policy. He sat between them with the serenity of a mediating party who charges by the hour and finds both clients satisfactory. Sierra looked at him. Algorithm looked back with the frank assessment of someone who has already made his decision and is simply allowing the paperwork to catch up. He's decided you're trustworthy, Elliot said. How can you tell? He's on the table. He only escalates to the table when he's made a final determination. It's the closing argument position. What was the deciding evidence? Unknown. His methodology is opaque. I've stopped asking for transparency. She looked at Algorithm for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. Something careful, something almost hesitant, something that Elliot suspected was the face of a person relearning what it felt like to be in a room where nothing required a defensive perimeter. Then she put her hand on the table, palm up, and Algorithm walked directly onto it and sat down with the authority of a verdict being delivered. The station hummed. The cartographic array blinked patiently on the far console, Grid 7 still technically unresolved. Outside the viewport, the slow traffic of ships moved through the dark in their orderly and indifferent lines, each one carrying its own cargo of distance and return. Elliot watched her hold his cat and understood that the conversation had moved past the territory he had maps for, and that this was, against all reasonable probability, exactly where he wanted to be. The viewport had always been Elliot's preferred place for thinking too much, and he had migrated there without deciding to. The way water finds its level without consulting anyone about the direction. The station's night cycle had completed its quiet takeover of the light, and the corridor outside was the specific dark of a place that is never fully dark, always edged with the soft operational glow of systems that do not sleep. He had been standing at the viewport for some time. He was not entirely sure how long. This was not unusual. The viewport had a way of suspending his relationship with the clock. Sierra was behind him at the table, and he could hear her, very faintly, turning one of the rocks. She had found them in the box on the secondary console shelf. The small collection he had assembled over years of surveying work, fragments pulled from uninhabited sectors, and kept for no professional reason he had ever been able to justify to the consortium's expense policy. Smooth basalt from a moon with no atmosphere. A piece of crystalline silicate that refracted the room's light into pale geometry across the wall. A compressed mineral disk from a debris field in Grid 9 that the array had flagged as a gravitational anomaly and turned out to be simply, uncommonly beautiful. He heard her turn each one over in her 2 long fingers and say nothing, and the sound of it did something to his chest that he was done pretending to have a clinical term for. "You still collect them," she said. "Occupational access," he said. "The consortium doesn't know. You collected them before you had occupational access." "I collected them because someone showed me that rocks were worth collecting." She was quiet, He heard her set one down. He turned from the viewport. She was holding the silicate piece, the one that threw light, and the light it was throwing was moving across the bioluminescent lines on her forearm, across the scars beneath them, across the geometry of everything that had been done and survived and carried this far. And the combined effect was the kind of accidental beauty that the universe occasionally produces without asking permission from anyone involved. He came back to the table. He did not sit down immediately. He stood at the edge of it and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the question that had been building through the entire architecture of the day, through the terrible coffee and the attendance records and the 15 years and algorithms jurisprudence, was present in the room with them now, solid and patient, waiting for one of them to give it its proper name. She gave it its name, she said. Does the promise still count? She asked it to the silicate piece at first. Then she asked it to him. He did not answer immediately. He had learned, somewhere in the long geography of a solitude. He thought about her, not the version he had kept on the wall map, preserved and 9 years old and unchanged, but the version at his table, holding a rock, with scars that ran along the bioluminescent lines and eyes that had seen 15 years of things he could not follow her into. He thought about the fact that she had kept one thing. Through the conditioning and the conflicts and the systematic reconstruction of everything she had kept him, not as a person she was certain still existed, but as a coordinate, a fixed point from before the alteration of everything. He thought that a fixed point is not nothing. A fixed point is, in cartographic terms, the thing everything else is measured from. He said, I think the promise was made to a person. And I think you're still a person, so I think it still counts. She looked at him. The luminescence at her jaw moved through its warmer register, and the silicate piece threw its pale, refracted light across the wall between them. An algorithm, who had relocated to the couch in the manner of someone who has overseen the proceedings and found them satisfactory, made a sound of minimal but genuine approval. She said, That's a very cartographer answer. I work with coordinates, he said. Every point counts, even the ones in uninhabited sectors. Especially those. They're the ones nobody else bothered to map. She set the silicate piece down on the table between them, precisely, the way she did everything, with the care of someone who has learned that objects placed carelessly tend not to be where you left them when you need them. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him and said, with the directness of someone who has spent 15 years in situations that did not reward indirectness, I don't know who I am. In the spaces where the conditioning doesn't operate, I don't know what's left of the person who made that promise. I know, he said, that doesn't worry you. It worries me the right amount, he said. Which is to say, it worries me in the way that anything worth understanding worries you, not because you want to run from it, but because you want to get it right. She was quiet. The station hummed. I also don't know who I am, he said, in the specific sense that I have spent 7 years in a waiting room pretending it was a destination, talking primarily to a cat whose therapeutic method is sitting on things, and naming a plant suspicious because it survived without my help, and I found that personally challenging. So we are, between us, a fairly complete picture of two people who need to figure something out. She looked at him for a long moment. Then the smile arrived, not the almost smile, not the neighborhood of it, but the actual thing, new and fully hers, belonging entirely to the person at this table on this station on this improbable Tuesday, and to no version of anyone either of them used to be. It was not the smile of the child he had remembered. It was better than that. It was the smile of someone choosing to make one, which is the only kind worth anything. You're still terrible at jokes, she said. They're load-bearing, he said. I've told you, they're holding up less than you think. And yet the building stands. Algorithm from the couch offered a final sound of resigned endorsement. Elliot looked at the wall map above the console, at the rocky moon, the unpronounceable gas giant, the small marked dot of a place that had ended and been carried forward anyway in two people who had no business finding each other again, and had managed it regardless. He looked at it directly, for the first time in 11 years, without flinching. Outside the viewport, the ships moved through the dark in their slow and orderly courses, each one tracking a line from somewhere to somewhere else, crossing the unmapped space between with the ordinary faith of things that have decided their destination is worth the distance. The cartographic array blinked on the far console. Grid 7, still uncorrected, still patient. He would fix it in the morning. There was, for the first time in a long time, a morning he was genuinely interested in reaching.